Das radikale Gedankengut der Linken hat auf eine so starke Vermachtstellung erlangt, dass es jeder neue Generation von Jugendlichen in Grenada vergiftet. Radical leftist thinking has such a stronghold on Grenada that it poisons every new generation of youth. Stay with me. I would explain. So when I tell you that the NDC is hijacked by radical leftists, that, my friends, is not an exaggeration. Now, I want you to understand the political trajectory of the NDC. Now, as recent as 1990, the NDC party was viewed as, and doctrinally, was a centrist party. 1990. Then, you slowly saw the creeping in of the radical leftists. Some of them who went away and studied and they came back, slowly started to creep into the NDC. You see, the problem is that they knew they could not find a home initially in the NNP because you had a man, Dr. Keith Mitchell, who understood the thinking, the detrimental thinking of far radical leftists. So he kept them at bay. But the NDC had no vanguard to protect the party. So you saw these radical leftists started slowly creeping in. And they came in one by one by one. But this was not an accident. This was a devious plot to hijack the NDC. You have to understand that these very leftists have experience in operating like that because they did it before. So they were well trained in the art of hijacking parties. Because this is the same thing they did to the Jewel movement. The Jewel movement was foundationally formed by rural socialist Marxists. And then you had a hijacking of the Jewel movement by sudden intellectual petty bourgeois socialist Marxists who displaced the foundational members and corrupted the organization, hence leading to the new Jewel movement. And these impatient new brand of power-hungry, vicious radical leftists decided to oust Sir Eric Matthew Geary. So I want you to understand that the methods and means did not change when these radical leftists slowly entered the NDC. It did not change. They waited long enough when the numbers were strong, because some of them have a little bit of military experience, so they know you have to move like snakes in the grass. One come and then pops up its head to get part of the executive. And then before you know it, the whole executive is controlled by far radical leftists. So that is how you see now that you have an entirely different, unrecognizable NDC. There is no original, there is no NDC that had the foundations of centrist ideology. It is infiltrated, it is poisoned by radical leftists. So it is no surprise that the philosophy of the party now, the approach to the problems that the party face is mimic from leftist radical playbook. But none of this infiltration into the NDC and securing of political power and governmental power could have been achieved without the complicity of certain institutions, organizations, and affiliate gangsters within the society. Could not have been done. If they just remained in the party and talk all the radical leftist BS, they would have not gotten any traction or headway. But their philosophy and what they were preaching on the podium to the mass of Grenadian people had to be reinforced by the affiliates within the society and within the institutions in the society. And they didn't do it for naught. It's not like these people and these affiliates in the institutions and throughout the society was doing it for nothing. They were doing it to endear themselves to the NDC in hope that once the NDC gets into power, they will be rewarded handsomely. So I want you to understand and I want you to see the game. So one of these institutions that has always been willing to assist these radical leftists in the NDC is the unions in Grenada. Because the unions themselves are hijacked by radical leftists. And the people in the union, in some respects, were comrades of the people in NDC. So it was easy to get the unions to do the bidding of NDC, as was brilliantly seen prior to the last campaign, to help sabotage the last administration. For decades, these radical leftists have hijacked the union. And don't say, oh, well, everybody's going to say, well, traditionally, unions are usually leftists. But the most significant contributor to union rights and people of the working class in Grenada was not a far left radical leftist. So Eric Matthew Gary was not a far left radical leftist. But yet still, foundationally, he contributed significantly to the awareness and start of consideration for workers' rights in Grenada. But he was no far leftist, quite to the contrary. But once he set the foundation and understanding that workers' rights is significant, guess what? Again, same modus operandi. The far radical leftists never create anything or start anything. But like vultures waiting for carcasses, they sit on the sidelines and they hijack everything significant that is created. And that is exactly what happened to unions in Grenada. It was hijacked by far radical leftists. I want you to see this. I want you to understand what has happened, is happening, and if you're not careful, will continue to happen in your society. And they have a kind of education program of sorts, unwritten education program of sorts, and rewards and punishment for the new youth to follow, for the new youth to be indoctrinated into the philosophy of these radical leftists. So what you will see is that if the new youth want to make it or want to go forward, they have to toe the line and follow the teachings and doctrines of these far radical leftists. So it's no mystery that successively leadership of these unions are governed or are passed on to far radical leftists. And I'll tell you a recent story that was quite evident. You see all the sabotage that was taking place on the pension issue and other issues and the eagerness to quickly take industrial action in the last administration, that was not an accident. It was a ploy by radical leftists within the unions on the prompting of the comrades in NDC to sabotage the last administration. Because you would notice, as soon as NDC came in, they are a little more tolerant. They are less willing to take mass industrial action against the NDC. They are less willing to be out in the streets protesting to disrupt the labor force. Now, I want you to understand that is not an accident. Because some of them who were in the union in the previous administration were singing for their supper. And unfortunately, some of them were cut out of getting any supper when the NDC administration came into place. You see, I, like a typical wharf youth, grew up going to Empire Cinema. So our favorites used to be cowboy western movies and kung fu Chinese. You see, these movies tend to teach you a lot of things fundamentally about human nature. So if you remember the old cowboy western movies, when they go out on a robbery, you always have a scene where they're passing back through the desert. Let's say 5 of them went on a robbery. You see a scene where they're passing back through the desert, 5 of them. And within that 5, 2 or 3 gonna get cut down while they're passing through the desert. Because 2 or 3 within the group will plot against the other 2 or 3 so that the booty they received or robbed can be shared more evenly among 2 than it can be shared more evenly among 5. The pot would be bigger among 2 or 3 than it would be among 5. And that is exactly what happens in the annal of politics. So all these people in the last administration who were sabotaging NNP in the hope that they would have been handsomely rewarded when NDC came into power, got sidelined and left out. Now the booty and reward of government has to be shared among less. They have to make sure they share it among less so that less can individually get more. So you had a situation, for example, the young man, Brian Grimes. He was actively, in some respects, I would say, assisting the NDC in their political motives. He was all anti the last administration and fighting and doing all of this in the name of workers' rights. But you have to understand, the kid was indoctrinated under the tutelage of far radical leftists. So he himself, his psychology, his approach to industrial action was created and taught by far radical leftists that molded him. And if the kid had understood anything about the modus operandi of these far radical leftists and learned anything about the period 1790 to 83, he would have realized that he was in for a lot of trouble. He would have realized that they would have used him and then discard him. But he couldn't see that while he was trying to endear himself to them. And they were so ungrateful towards this gentleman that when they won, their biggest hitter was calling him some of the most degenerate names. He was referring to him because there was a little transition point where I believe he was still, the leader of the union while they came in. They turned on him and the biggest hitter was calling him a union donkey. Now, of course, I could not sit back and allow that level of vitriol in our society. So what did I do? I reprimanded the other young man, Kem Jones, who was talking to him like that and put a stop to it. And I don't believe that story is unique. There's so many other stories like that about people who broke their backs for the NDC and they themselves have gotten nothing for it. As a matter of fact, it's coincidental that I recently saw my good brethren Kem Jones on his show talking about how the NDC is not looking out for its own people. The guy was upset with the way the NDC is treating its own people. But for people like us who understand and who know about these far radical leftists, who know about them, we know that that is not new. They are opportunists, and there are people who will use you and then discard you as quick as they picked you up. So you would have thought that after the gentleman Brian Grams understood painfully how these radical leftists operate, you would have think that something would have clicked in the gentleman's mentality and thinking and say, you know what, no. I gotta abandon that old radical leftist thinking. I gotta abandon that old radical leftist thinking. This is not working for me, obviously, because look how I was treated. But no, he didn't do that. And that is why I tell you, the policies and the things that NDC do, they could not have done it or gotten away with it without complicity from people and institutions within the society. So the gentleman, still after the US-Venezuela spat started, the gentleman basically was towing the line and echoing what was being said by these radical leftists, these big deep-voiced radical leftists who was protesting all over the place. He was basically reinforcing what they were saying and reinforcing the government, the NDC, and the affiliates about what they were saying about the United States Venezuela spat. He was being emotional and non-critical thinking about the issue between the US and Venezuela. After all they did to the gentleman, after all he sacrificed to ensure that they won the election in some respects with the whole pension issue, and they turned and discarded him, the gentleman still continued to toe the line and echo pretty much and reinforce what was being said by the radical leftists about the issue of the US-Venezuela spat. So you have to understand. So if you have people who some people may regard as some sort of low-level leaders in the society, like, you know, having been a union leader and stuff like that, they would listen to them. And they may, in some respects, influence what these people think and say. That is why when you had all this support from radical leftists and then these little proteges, okay, then what you have happening is the Grenadian people are now intoxicated and believe that that is the best approach to deal with the situation. So you will see then that the Grenadian people said exactly what these radical leftists are saying. So the young leftists pretty much, so you have to understand what I said from the beginning. The young leftist was indoctrinated by his predecessors. So it's not an accident that he has the same mentality. And so during that time, the gentleman was saying all the negative things about Donald Trump and the United States. And he would think after recent events that he had an opportunity to self-correct. He had an opportunity to gain some clarity. After seeing the government response on the situation, you thought the gentleman himself would have gotten some clarity. But the gentleman still continues to say some of the most outrageous, reckless things about Donald Trump. And it's so sad. It's really sad. You don't get to talk about a man like Donald Trump, who in modern politics has achieved some of the most amazing feats by any measure, and has withstood some of the most brutal onslaught against him, and had stood the test of time, and still came back and win the presidency. And this kid, by some measure, in this low-level politics, decides that he is in some position to talk about this geopolitical global master? You must be kidding me. So this is delusional. But this, because these young kids, but because these people are regarded sometimes as leadership in the society, they're able to influence Grenadians, regular Grenadians, to the detriment of the nation. Because they propagate radical leftist speech and mentality to the Grenadian youth. after all that has transpired, the gentleman should come to the public and say, look, you know what? I erred. You know what? I erred in what I was saying. And for the youth of Grenada, he should say, look, you know, I understand. I totally dropped the ball. I didn't understand geopolitics. And I made a mistake in my analysis. I made a mistake in supporting the radical leftists that was talking all that crap. They themselves have gone silent. But the kid still decides, I don't know, I'm sort of confused for his motivation for still doing it. I don't know if it's a cover to say, oh, you know, well, let me delude myself into believing that really what I was saying was true. So there might be some sort of embarrassment that he totally didn't understand the fundamentals of regional and global politics. So like, oh, let me continue to just say what I'm saying because I truly believe in what I'm saying. When evidence contradicts and clearly shows how wrong you were on the issue. But it takes guts. It takes guts and courage to show that you were wrong on something and accept that you were wrong. So the gentleman pretty much is pulling a Deacon Mitchell on us. But that must be a mentality among some around that age group. But you see, we grew up like real cock and balls men. When we made mistakes, we accepted we made mistakes. So yeah, I see the gentleman still talking all that nonsense about Donald Trump and the United States. What a shame. That is so shameful. And in some respects, disgusting. You have to understand, with some sort of leadership, whether it be low level, middle level, or upper tier, that your words have a bit of influence. So there's responsibility. If you claim to care so much about the society and the people in the society, you wouldn't be this reckless. And even when you realize that you were reckless, you would self-correct. But again, as I said, that seems to be the mentality and the attitude of some of the youth in that age group. Because if the Prime Minister himself doesn't come and acknowledge that he was absolutely wrong in his diplomatic approach to the US-Venezuela spat, then I guess who is Brian Grimes not to accept responsibility? So my friends, the bottom line is this, that nothing this administration has done, is doing and will do can be achieved by them alone. There are people within the society, there are institutions within the society that are complicit in offering up Grenada at the altar. And you must look at them and be aware of them. Even when these people who hijacked the NDC and these young cats who parachuted into the NDC, okay, they didn't do it by accident. Some of them were brought in by grown people. Grown people who got a little reward or a little post in the government now. They were brought in by them. They were like, yeah, you know, I'm bringing in this dude. He's a solid dude. You know, he's going to help out the party. So they were brought in to an established party that used to be a centrist party that was hijacked by radical leftists. So NDC in a post-George Brezan and those guys' world is just a victim. Okay? It's just a victim. It's like a carcass. So every vulture comes and take a bite. That is what NDC is right now. Every vulture that smells carcass within NDC comes and takes a bite. So that is why you see NDC was used as a vehicle to get into government, and then now the government is being used as a machination for these people to self-enrich at the ultimate expense of the Grenadian people. Because the Grenadian people, while they self-enrich, the Grenadian people gets pennies on the dollar. So you break your back for people who gives you pennies on the dollar. And now the money is running dry. You ain't even going to get pennies on the dollar. And they're not even giving you an opportunity to make your own money. They're sabotaging and destroying by the ill-advised, unwise diplomatic and geopolitical approach to situations. They're destroying your ability to make a couple dollars for yourself. The US $50 million fish export business, gone. And do you think, based on the US-Venezuela spat, based on how they disregarded, disrespect the United States, do you think the United States will be willing and eager to resolve this issue? Do you think so? Which world you guys live in? Which world do you guys live in? Even on a local level, between interaction between people and friends, when you slight people, you think they don't reassess the relationship with you? You think the United States is not going to reassess its relationship with Grenada? No, I guess you guys are listening to even more radical leftists like Ruckus Ferguson when he says, oh, why should there be consequences for saying no? There shouldn't be no consequences for saying no. That is how unwise and unstrategic in thinking these people are. But these are the ninjas that you look up to. These are the ninjas that you put your life, your well-being, and the security of the nation. These are the people whose hands you put it in. And the young kid leftist, what does he do? He follows this sort of mentality. This sort of mentality. So you have a next generation propagating this sort of garbage radical leftist philosophy.